Hi, I'm Jonathan. It's a great pleasure to be joining you here today, even if it is virtually rather than in person. I've been asked to talk about transformation in local government. It's a really important topic, and it's something we hear a lot about. But what do we mean when we talk about transformation? Well, normally we think about transformation from one thing to another. So we need first to ask, what is local government now? Why does it need to change? What do we want it to become? And then, how do we get there? And too often I think we get hung up in the middle of this, the how of transformation, not the what or the why. And of course there's a whole industry around this, as you all know. So in this speech I'd like to talk a little bit about the pressures local government is under. How does it need to change in response to these pressures? But first we need to be clear about what local government is. What type of thing is it? Or rather, what type of things? Because actually there are two quite distinct aspects to local government. On the one hand, it's a representative democratic institution, a way of giving people within communities voice and agency through their elected representatives. On the other hand, it's a technocratic institution designed to deliver public services at a local level. Now, those are both really, really important, and there can be a productive marriage between them, but they're not the same thing. And indeed, many of local government's challenges through the ages can be traced to the sometimes uneasy alignment of these two distinct faces. That's something the British academic Colin Copas has traced in some detail in a recent book. So crucially, if we want to think about how local government needs to change, we need to understand that while the pressures on each of these aspects of local government share some similarities, they actually take us in quite different directions. So let's start with public services. So here, the need for innovation is driven by the immediate challenge of fiscal austerity, which is a particularly acute challenge here in the UK, but which is also present globally. But also, even more importantly, by the profound questions raised by long-term challenges, such as an aging population, a fluid, highly competitive global economy, population movement, climate change, urbanisation, technological development, and these pressures all create a steeply rising demand for public services. So in the UK, we know, for example, that the cost of care for elderly people is likely to triple over the next 50 years. Or the cost of tackling diabetes, which is already 10% of our health services budget, will rise to 17% within 20 years. But it's not just a question of scale. The nature of the demand is changing as well. We're seeing a shift from acute to chronic conditions, which require early intervention and collaborative management. We're recognizing the complex interdependency of social, physical and economic conditions. And as users, we are demanding services that flex around our needs and our lives rather than being determined by rigid institutional structures. So in response to this, I think the broad outline of public service reform is becoming quite clear. We need to move from a system that's geared towards acute intervention to one that's characterized by demand management, by prevention, by integration of services, by multi-agency working, and which is co-produced with and designed around the needs of service users. Now that means recognizing that the real challenges we face cannot be solved by the state alone. Instead, they require collaborative engagement from all parts of the public realm, a new relationship between citizens, civil society, and the local state, in which each supports the other in a contribution to the common good. But that, in turn, means thinking about the total asset base of a community. It means thinking about the value in social networks and civic energy. It means thinking about early intervention, not just in terms of prevent or invest to save, but as building capacity and resilience within communities. It means considering how we structure incentives for action, for the market, yes, but most importantly for citizens. And it means understanding the networks of social action that are already present in every community and aligning public services with them. But that's a very different vision of what a council does. It's a convener, it's a facilitator, it's a catalyst of civic action. And look, again, we know quite a lot about what that might look like. We've got lots of examples, lots of innovation and best practice, a whole literature. The challenge isn't imagining it, the challenge is taking it to scale. But here's the problem. At precisely the time we need to make this shift, the pressures on the council as a democratic institution are making it harder, not easier. Around the world, our politics is being changed by a widespread collapse of trust in institutions. This encompasses politics, the media, banks, large corporations, and inevitably to some extent, local government. Now, I've argued, and indeed I made this point when I was in Australia earlier in the year, that while this is often talked about under the label of post-truth politics, that is a politics in which people's beliefs are defined by emotional resonance rather than objective evidence, it actually makes more sense to talk about post-institutional or post-trust politics. So this collapse in trust has many sources. Some are general, the changing nature of employment in post-industrial economies, the differential effects of globalization, rapid population changes in some communities. Some are more specific, such as the financial crisis of '08, or in the UK, the MP's expenses scandal of 2009, or the Grenfell Tower fire this year, and I'm sure you could come up with your own list down there. And all of these, though, feed a sense that decision-making elites are detached from and no longer represent the interests of the people they are meant to serve. So people who feel let down and left behind by globalization or contemporary culture or capitalism or the way in which their society is changing are rejecting politics as usual. And where we used to think about left versus right, or rich versus poor, or labour versus capital, politics is now contested in the spaces between a new set of oppositions: open versus closed, rooted versus cosmopolitan, local versus global, evidence versus emotional resonance, and institutions versus networks. What the British writer David Goodhart has recently described as a culture war between somewhere and anywhere. Now, Brexit, Trump, Macron, all in different ways, are both symptoms of and causes of post-institutional politics, a politics in which a trust in networks replaces trust in institutions. Now, I don't think we should get too carried away with the idea that representative politics is broken. Firstly, because this can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we say it enough, people believe it. And the historical record shows that that opens up political space for really dangerous forms of populism. And secondly, we must be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Without denying its limitations, I think we could still argue that representative democracy is perhaps the single most powerful engine for progress, fairness, prosperity that human beings have ever created. But of course, it goes through ebbs and flows, and it's better. Representational democracy is better at dealing with some circumstances than others. And this has been explored a lot by political theorists. So in his book, Setting the People Free, the British political philosopher John Donne argues that democracy is an adaptive phenomenon that emerged as a tool to deal with a specific set of problems in ancient Athens, and then kind of transmuted nearly 2,000 years later into a much more totalizing conception of politics, one which he argues has established a clear claim to meet a global need better than any of its competitors. But, as he shows, the function of democracy is always determined by the historical and structural conditions in which it operates. And this means that while the democratic process can, of course, claim to shape the world it's in, it's also always playing catch-up with external developments. The political theorist Nadia Urbanati has made a similar point when she argues that the problem's not with representation as such, but the capacity of representative institutions to respond to the content and purpose of that representation. Meanwhile, David Runciman, another Cambridge political scientist, has shown how, wrote a book called The Confidence Trap, and he shows how democracy is, it kind of operates through a sort of fuzzy logic that makes it better suited to solving some sorts of problems than others. So it's really great at adapting to crisis, and it's really bad at sort of long-term adaptive planning, or as he puts it, in other words, democracies are great at recovering from emergencies, but they're really bad at avoiding them in the first place. So I think right now we're going through a period of evolution as the institutions through which we instantiate representative democracy struggle to adapt to a world in which networks, not institutions, are the primary form of social and political organisation. And we're only at the beginning of understanding what that really means in practice and what an impact that's going to have. And look, to date, certainly in the UK, local government has retained a higher degree of trust than national government has, although that's not a very high bar. But it can't stand apart from these changes. It's not immune to these broader trends. And, if we're honest, it remains quite an institution in a post-institutional world. What makes local government at its best so special is that there's a direct democratic mechanism through which the concerns and the needs and the aspirations of communities are hardwired into the decision-making by their elected representatives. And when that's not working, local government loses its practical and ideological raison d'etre. Post-trust politics matters. It matters desperately, not only because it opens the door to irresponsible strains of populism, but because it closes the door to the sort of change we need to see, the sort of transformed, facilitative local government I described earlier, that's more network than institution. That sort of local government relies on the engagement of its citizens. It relies on trust, just when there is less trust than ever to go around. So we have a trust deficit. And unless we can fix that, we can't ever see the sort of change we need in local government. So what do we do? So in the last couple of minutes, I'd like to suggest 4 steps we can take to start on this journey. First, we have to reframe the narrative, internally and externally. This is not a problem with communities not getting what institutions are trying to do. It's a problem with institutions not responding to people in the way people need. If people feel let down by institutions, well, guess what? That's because institutions have let them down. So we need to take their concerns and their aspirations seriously, even when we don't agree with them. And we have to build emotionally resonant narratives that engage people in a positive politics. We can't just leave that to dangerous populists. Secondly, we have to start with place. Trust begins in a dialogue about the places we live in. What do the people who live here now, whether they've lived here for 5 minutes or 50 years or 500 years, or in the UK sometimes 5,000 years, what do the people who live here now aspire to? How can we live together effectively? What is the relationship of this place to the wider world? What are our priorities? What are compromises that we're willing to make? Thirdly, local government needs to act like a network, not an institution. It needs to focus on outcomes for people and for places, not on its own institutional structures or processes or hierarchies. Now, people talk a lot about this, but think about whether you're really supporting it in your institution, in your organization. You need to sweat the dull stuff. Does your performance management, does your appraisal system actually incentivize the behaviors you want? There's a whole behavioral science of change out there. Are you really supporting people to understand change and their role in it? It's not good enough just to tell people to be different. We have to understand what the barriers to that are, why they're resisting change, what might incentivize them to do things differently. If we can't engage frontline staff in that way, you're never going to get change across the organization. Finally, most importantly, participation, participation, participation. You need an uncompromising focus on participation and dialogue in everything you do. Citizens' juries, participatory budgeting, online engagement platforms, good old-fashioned town hall meetings. There's loads of tools out there for doing that. But you need to commit to them and invest in them. And here's the other thing. For too many communities, the council is still the castle on the hill. It's not enough just to open the gates. They're not going to come in. You need to go to where they are. Parks, shopping malls, community halls. You have to go to them. Now, all 4 of these things are easy to say and hard to do, but if you can do them, they all start to design trust back into the system. And what we'll find is not just that trust is the essential building block for the change we need, but that trust is itself the change we need. Trust is our most important transformation. Thank you very much.